So my name's Hank Woodward. I wanted to give everyone just a couple minutes to get in here, but it's now 10:02, so I think it's a fine time to get going. So welcome to the Nuances of Digital Printing for Fabrics demonstration. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Okay, so the very first thing I want to just make sure everyone's aware of is our MySCAD website. I know we've talked about that a few times in previous sessions, but it's really, really important for all of the lab resources. So I'm just going to share that screen. Particularly, we want to pay special attention to the fabric printing section of the website, which is located here. You can get to this website via this URL here, which Pedro, maybe you could copy and paste that into the chat. And then, but it's accessible via MySCAD under the Resources tab. It is going to be a link that says DigiLab SCAD Lab, just like that. And then on the sidebar here, that's where all the different technologies are. So we're going to focus on fabric printing today. And I just want to draw your attention to the file preparation and the submission preparation sections and subsections. You can also always get to those from the bottom of any page within the fabric printing section. So the reason for that is because we've got a bunch of information here, a whole lot of video tutorials about how to tackle maybe any issues that you come across during your file preparation. And I just wanted to make sure you all were aware that those resources are on the website. And so you can refer back to these, in the future. The same goes for the submission preparation tab. Just a couple like final checks. And these are a lot of the checks that we go through as technicians just to make sure that everything's on the up and up. And that once we print your work, you're getting what you're expecting to get. But it's totally worthwhile doing like a pre-flight check before you ever send files to us or try to bring files into us. Just so that way we're all on the same page and there aren't any surprises. Okay, let's see. So today we're going to talk about verifying a successful repeat unit, considerations for inherent noise in digital printing, fabric-specific design quirks, and then designing with type for fabrics. Okay, so one of the main things to note is, I'm actually going to stop the screen share, sorry. So one of the main things to note about digital fabric printing is, in some cases, for your project, you might require yardage of fabric, right? So let's say you want 3 yards of fabric. That's going to be 108 inches long. And if you set up your Photoshop file, your TIFF file at 108 inches in height by whatever your width may be for the fabric that you're printing on, if you try to turn that into us, that's going to be a huge, huge, huge file. Like maybe even over a gigabyte, right? So, sure, like if you're able to bring files in on a flash drive or something like that, that might be possible, but it still might take like a couple minutes, like 5 to 10 minutes or so just to try to transfer that file over. And frankly, it'll be a total nightmare trying to transfer a file like that, like over the internet, right? So either submitting files to your professors via Blackboard, like all of those upload, download times are going to be way, way, way high if you're trying to submit a file that is fully flooded out for your final print. There are cases where that's unavoidable. Say you've got something that's very illustrative or something very photographic, and you're trying to produce like a very large photograph, right, at full scale. There's no real way around that, having like that full file size. But for something that's a repeat design, it's far more efficient to submit a repeat unit, which overall generally is a much smaller file than what your final yardage may be. So let's see. I am actually going to go back to the website. Sorry about that. Because I do want to show just a quick little, oh, I'm sorry. We can actually do this in Photoshop. Okay. Just a moment. Oops. Okay. So I've prepared a couple of files for us this morning to go over repeat units. So this very first file we're going to look at is actually a repeat unit that is incorrect. So it will not repeat successfully. One of the most important things about preparing a repeat unit and submitting that for production is, at the end of the day, it is the student's responsibility. It is your responsibility that your repeat unit repeats successfully. The technicians, myself, Pedro, will do our best to try to vet that before we start production. But sometimes, like, we're talking about like a hairline of pixels that are missing or out of alignment, and that can lead to gaps in the repeat. And sometimes that's just like really, really difficult for us to eyeball check. And it's something that sometimes isn't apparent until the end of the process. So we're going to talk about strategies to confirm that your repeat units are correct and how to check for that. So one of the first things I want to draw your attention to is actually the offset filter. So if you go into the filter panel and you go down to other and offset, this repeat unit is meant to be 6 inches high by 12 inches wide. I happen to know that the pixel dimensions for that, because this offset filter does work in pixels, is 900 by 1800. So what you can kind of start to see here is there are some issues in this flower, right? And there are some issues in where these lines are meant to match up, right? And so this is something that might happen like over the process while you're trying to set up your repeat. And it's a really valid way to just confirm and double check that your repeat units will match up. I'll go ahead and create a pattern real quick from this and flood it out so you can see the effect of that over the like final size of the material. The strategy we're going to use there is to go under Edit, Define Pattern, and we're going to commit to this name. And then I do have a different flood test file, and we can go and fill this with our wrong pattern. And in just a moment, we should see that pop up. Okay, so now if I zoom in here, it's a little subtle, but you can see like all these flawed flowers, right? And there are these long vertical kind of errors in their overall repeat. The horizontal error is a little bit more subtle, but there is technically an error there. Again, as we look at this flower, you can see like that's not joining up correctly. The way these stripes are designed, actually it's very subtle, and you actually won't be able to tell that there's an issue with the stripes themselves, but these different accents and motifs are problematic there. Okay, so that's what a wrong repeat unit looks like. This is a file that I prepped ahead of time. This is like our goal. So when this is flooded out, it is seamless. And you can see that there's like 4 kind of quarters of that smaller flower. And the way that this was set up, those all kind of come back together to create that full flower with 0 errors. And the way that we can see that is in the setup file. One strategy that I used to set this up was actually by designing with that offset filter. So that flower asset is this red copy flower. And we can go ahead and use that offset filter. Now, these numbers were already correct, but as you start to slide these around, you can see that the flower wraps around the borders of the canvas, right? So you can actually use that to perfectly place these assets like in all the corners. And it'll automatically, once you get that placed in the right spot, it'll automatically put that into, so it wraps perfectly, flawlessly, and that flower will come back together and look correct when it's all flooded out. So because I already know how big my canvas size is, which if we want to confirm that, you can go under Image, Canvas Size. We can see 6 by 12 here. And then because the offset filter works in pixels, we can then write down these values And then what you want to do is then do a little bit of math and divide those by 2. And so those are the values that you'll want to input into your offset filter in order to get things positioned perfectly in the corners and such, in those overlaps. The nice thing, though, about the offset filter is that because it automatically makes things wrap around the side, you don't actually have to perfectly position things in the corner. As long as it's done with the offset filter, it'll come back together to make a hole. But I like things to be pretty precise. So if we go back into the offset filter here, again, it's remembering the values I had in before. But if we go to drag that out, you can start to see we're pretty close here. And then if we just type in 1800 there, it wraps on the side. And then I do want a vertical offset of 900 for to get that to go top and bottom as well. So then once we commit to that, we're all set as far as this unit is concerned. We can go ahead and save that out. I've already done that because I don't want us to sit through any save times. And we can see that this is what that repeat looks like when it is flooded out to the full length. So you might be able to see that this file type is actually a PSB file type instead of a PSD file type. And this is for like very, very large files. And so the fact that Photoshop automatically assigned that file extension to this at this image size of 52 inches wide by 108 inches high, which is 3 yards. It's a very, very, very large file type and would be really unfeasible to try to send over like through Blackboard or things like that. Whereas the actual file size, I think I can pull that up for you, is, let's see, properties. Yeah, so the actual repeat unit that we were looking at before, this file size, even though it's 6 inches by 12 inches in real life, it's only like a 230 megabyte file, which is still too big to send over email, but is totally valid, like and easy to send like up through Blackboard or other means. Let's see. Okay. So, okay, so I think that's it for the successful repeat unit section. We do have resources on the website for that. Let's see, sorry, I'm gonna share my screen one more time. Go back to MySCAD, okay. So this is on the file preparation page. And, we've got some other demos of what incorrect repeat patterns look like and what successful ones look like. And then actually we've got this little interactive piece where we tried to highlight some of the errors here, but when you click on that, it opens up much larger. In just a moment, perhaps. Sorry, I should have opened this ahead of time. But you can start to identify like where those seams are for yourself, just to get a better understanding of what's happening here. Okay, so let's see. Let's see here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about considering inherent noise. So one of the first questions you might have is like, well, what do I actually mean by that? And the most common place where we see this is with very large applications of a single color with digital printing. So let's see here. So here's like a little sample on polysatin. And it's going to be really difficult to tell over camera. But like these individual swatches, right, they're all a single color. And there is a little bit of noise in that printed effect there. So one of the key differences is that digital printing is a digital process. Other means of printing onto fabric, like screen printing, people are pulling a, they're pulling like a homogeneous mixture of a pre-mixed dye and ink over the surface of that material. So the dye itself is already homogeneous and uniform. So it's really like a solid application of that desired color. And I've got a little example of that. So we're going to hop back into the screen share. Okay. So this is like, if you're unfamiliar with screen printing, this is kind of what that process is. You'll see here, like this gentleman poured out like a pre-mixed batch of ink for the screen printing process. And then they're literally pulling that homogeneous mixture across their screen. And that's applying it to the material. Let's see. And we can go a little bit faster. But then they go and they pick that up, and you can see the print is then on the material there. So one of the big differences or considerations for this whole process is that this is digital. And what that means is that there are a ton of very, very, very fine dots of dye being jetted from the print heads. The printers are all loaded with 8 different unique dyes, colors. And then the print heads themselves are taking all of those 8 different channels and they're intermixing them to create the colors of your file. However, they're not physically mixing. They're just being placed right next to each other in very close proximity to give the appearance of your final desired color. I do have like a little photo reference for that. So we can stop showing this YouTube video. And we can go back into, okay. Go back into this. So here you can see kind of what's happening here. This isn't the most high-res example, but this is like a very nice picture of a flower that's been printed. But when you look really, really, really close up, you can see all these little different dots of the individual channels of color. In this case, this was a CMYK process, and this was like a paper print, so it's a little bit different. But so you're only going to see 4 unique colors here. With our textile printers, we actually have 8 different channels. But the main thing to take note of is that if you're trying to do like a large solid print of a single color, you may end up seeing individual droplets of that when you look very, very closely of the different dyes that the printer has access to. So if that's an effect that you really desire or something you're looking for, it might be good to consider a different means of production. But the digital textile printers are a great way to prototype different designs. And it also means that they're actually better off at producing kind of like raster images or like pixel-based images, things with a lot of variance naturally, like in those assets, as opposed to something that's very graphic, like very uniform, solid masses of color. Let's see. Okay. So once you're aware that that's something that can happen, there are different strategies, or there's a few strategies to try to like reduce that effect. And I think one of the main goals here is to just try to take control of that process. So if you understand that for a large area of a single color, there's going to be some level of noise there, rather than letting that be kind of done by the printer however it's going to produce to make that color appear. You can go ahead and introduce your own texture and your own variance to those solid areas to try to break it up. And by acting with intention, you're then in control of that process a little bit more, right? And that inherent noise becomes a little bit less noticeable because there's other visual aspects going on. And one consideration there is also like the natural texture of the fabric itself. So like our linen, for example, is far more textural physically. And that will also play a role in kind of reducing the perception of that noise of the print itself. Let's see here. Okay. If we look back at that Photoshop file, you'll notice that I did try to employ that strategy with these darker blue, these slightly lighter blue stripes. And like this was a kind of like a noise texture that I applied to that solid area of blue to try to break it up a little bit and introduce a little bit of variance. There are other strategies for this, and I'll jump out of Photoshop again, sorry, and just show you a couple examples of previous student work where they took advantage of this. At this time, I don't have a ton of examples of like a solid massive printed color because this is like a strategy that's taught in a couple different classes. And so a lot of the work that we receive or things that we might have samples of prior student work, they've already kind of worked around this issue. But let's see here. So for example, this piece here, right? There's a whole lot of visual texture going on. And so if there is any inherent noise, which there is, sorry, it's really kind of just masked by the variance of color going on in here, right? So this was very painterly, very kind of distressed. And it goes a long way towards, you know, making every aspect of your print feeling considered. Let's see. We also have, this is a little sample of something, but so see, like even in this little green guy up here, not only is there like a kind of hatch pattern over it, but also in just the green background color there's some lighter values of green, some darker values of green. You can see that also as well in this larger shape down here with the yellows, right? So adding visual texture is a great way to work around that. And it just makes things feel, you know, cohesive and considered overall. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, just going through my notes. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the fabric specific design quirks. I've got a couple overall notes. I've got a couple dye specific notes. And then I've got the fabric specific notes. So please bear with me. Just to refresh everyone, we've got 3 different digital printers over at number 9 in the 9 lab. And the reason for that is because there's 3 different dye sets that are compatible with different kinds of fabric. So there's reactive dye, acid dye, and dispersed dye. Reactive dye is compatible with plant-based fibers. So we're working with our cottons and our linens on that machine. Acid dyes are compatible with protein-based fibers. That's gonna be our silks. So we've got a silk charmeuse and a silk organza. And then our third printer's got dispersed dyes loaded, and that's gonna be compatible with our synthetics, our polyester satin, and our polyester voile. As far as like overall design considerations, be very, very mindful of contrast. So that can be applied in a couple different ways. But one of the main notes here is that all of our fabrics are pre-coated in special chemistry that really, really, really wants to hold on to all the dye droplets it can, right? That's why digital printing as a technology with textiles is possible, is because of that coating. Without that coating, dyes would just hit the fabric and it'd bleed out everywhere. You never get that accurate reproduction of your digital imagery. But because of that coating, as we move through the printing process, the heat fixation process, which is either going to be steaming or a direct dry heat through the calendar press, there's an opportunity for the dye to like vaporize for just a moment as it then like bonds with the fibers of the fabric itself. So one consideration there is that if you have something that's traditionally very high contrast, something that's a very, very dark color next to, let's say, maybe an unprinted area or a white field within your design, when the dye is actually bonding with the fabric, there is an opportunity for some of that very, very dark and saturated color to migrate over into that unprinted area. And that's because that chemistry is still on the fabric and it wants to hold on to all the dye it possibly can. So one consideration we have is, if you do want to work with something very, very high contrast, instead of having a very stark white area of your design, consider maybe applying a slight off-white there. It could be like a very, very high tint of a color, something with maybe a little bit of noise to it or texture to it, visual texture to it. And so, even if let's say it's like a 5% like yellow being applied to that area or something like that, like a very high tint of a color, there's still a little bit, some level of, of that dye being applied to the material. And therefore that chemistry that's on the fabric is going to be kind of happy and satisfied with the amount of dye it's holding on to. And it'll be a lot less likely for any of those darker colors to move over into those unprinted areas or otherwise unprinted areas. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to reactive dye. So the reactive dye is again for cotton and linen. This dye itself is generally quite true as far as color reproduction goes. All of our dye sets and printers are color profiled to be as accurate to the files as possible, but there are some unique variances there. So let's see. The one thing to note about reactive dye is that it's very, very sensitive to the printing environment. So the lab over at number 9 is temperature and humidity controlled. But if that were to go out of whack for something or if something needed maintenance, there's a chance that like grayscale might start to turn kind of brownish. And we'll be sure to notify you if that's something that's happening. We might ask you to consider a different fabric choice if possible. But we'll always try to give you a heads up if there's any problems like that. That doesn't happen that often, but it's just something that we want to communicate now in here. For acid dye, again, that's our silks. Generally, the acid dye is a little bit warmer in color reproduction. This does include grayscale. It still reads as gray, but it's a little bit warmer. And the reds are really fantastic there. So just to compare really quick. Whoops. Okay. So, this is our silk charmeuse. And this is a grayscale image on a sample that we've got printed. Those gray values are a little warm, a little reddish, right? That is just kind of by nature of the dye set itself. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to dispersed dyes. This is compatible with our polyesters. Those are, by comparison, quite a bit cooler. The reds are also a little bit cooler. So there may be like slightly feel a little bit red-violet. The polyesters, the dispersed dye is also the best dye set at kind of reproducing what's traditionally like a CMYK color space. This is maybe most applicable to any like graphic designers or people who do a lot of like normal paper print production, thinking about using fabric as a media for a project. We have had a lot of projects from graphic designers in the past, so just wanted to kind of make that note here. Okay. So linen, we're going to move on to linen. Grayish values can read a little bit almost like olive in appearance. There's a little bit of green hint there. And that's actually in contrast to cotton, right? So cotton and linen are being printed on the same printer, the same die set. But literally just because of the differences of the cellular structure of cotton versus the cellular structure of linen, the color reproduction is a little bit different. So grayscale can read a little bit slightly green on linen. Yes, okay. So silk organza is our next fabric. I've got a lot of notes for this one. we've got this sample on the website as well, but we've done a whole bunch of different kind of opacity runs of the same design over the length of this fabric. The one main thing to note is that for very dark value colors, we talked about contrast before, for very dark value colors on silk organza, there can be this kind of like spiderwebbed like bleed effect as the dye kind of travels along the individual fibers. Part of that's due to the less dense weave structure of this fabric. But if we dial back the opacity just a little bit, then we start to reduce that effect while still maintaining a similar printed result, right? So your colors still appear to be the same, but it just, okay. But it's a strategy that you can employ in your files to help prevent that from happening. And that's something that we'll talk about with you as well when you come into the facility. Okay. We also have a demonstration of that exact file on the website. So you can take a look at that in closer detail at your own convenience. Okay. And then, okay. So that's it for the fabric specific considerations. Okay. And then my last notes here are about designing with type. This might not be applicable to everyone, but if you are working with type on fabric, one of the main things to note is, look, you might be used to or familiar with printing type on paper. If you're working on your design file and you do test prints on paper, just because it looks good on paper does not mean it's going to look good on fabric. There is a slight amount of bleed that will happen as the dye droplets hit the material and and bond to the material. So if you're trying to render very small letter forms, individual letter forms, they can become kind of illegible, frankly. Now, there is a certain scale where that no longer really applies, and it can be different depending on the fabric that you're working with as well. But generally speaking, sans serif fonts, so like things like Helvetica, they can render a little bit better than serif fonts, and that's because serif fonts have those fine little tapers, right? So we brought up contrast before. Serif fonts are kind of innately a higher contrast letter form. So those little tapers can be hard to render at smaller sizes. Typically, you need to go a little bit bigger with your font choices if you're maybe making like a poster or something with type, or if you had a very kind of more graphic-oriented print that you're trying to produce. It's not that you can't work with serif fonts, but your font sizes are going to need to be a little bit bigger to help out with that. Okay, so the other thing to note is, I talked about this earlier, but maybe we've seen a lot of cases where people maybe have like a field of color and then they're trying to put white type on top of that. Again, this comes down to contrast. So the dye of that background color is going to want to migrate into your white type. So not only does it need to be quite large to try to help reduce that from happening, but again, the introduction of an off-white instead of a true white will go a long way towards helping your design render correctly without any flaws. Okay. So at this point, we're going to move on to Q&A.
This is Vivian. Is it possible to print in upholstery kind of fabrics for furniture design?
Okay. So in our previous session last week on Thursday, we went over some options that we have access to here. One of the big things is, so I mentioned that special chemistry that's on all of our fabrics. We do stock only a specific set of fabric, and this goes a long way to, so the fabrics that we have that are most maybe akin to upholstery or would be maybe valid for prototyping upholstery is like our linen and our cotton. or maybe even our polyester satin. They're the most structural materials that we have. We don't have any true upholstery materials. However, there have been furniture design students in the past that have utilized like the linen for their work. And as far as like communicating the concept and presenting the work was really quite successful. All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, then I'd like to just thank everyone for coming here today. We had a lot more people come in than I thought we might have at the beginning of the session. Again, please check out our website. We've done a whole lot to really like bolster that with new content, and hopefully like it should really help you out with just your file preparation and reducing the amount of errors that you might encounter before you actually turn things in. So there's a whole ton of video tutorials, and we really try to break everything down there. So again, thank you for coming out.